Okay, chapter 21. With the sun beginning its descent, the lake was like a sheet of glass and mirrored the sky overhead. Blue had been replaced with the fiery hues of autumn. Deep reds and oranges and yellows rolled over the water in waves. Across the water, at the center of the lake, was the island, and on it the house. There was a canoe docked on the island shore, paddles resting on the ground beside it, and a brilliant light was emitted from within the dwelling. A rack for smoking meat outside the entrance to the house, not unlike the ones in Mississauga but poorly constructed, was empty. The man, it seemed, was not immune to the lack of game. "It's good that we've come now," Ochek said. The group was at the shore, looking out over the water and towards the house. "Soon, the man will move on if there's nothing left to eat here. He will move on until there's nowhere left to move on to." "I'd say if that's the case, this is something we're doing not just for Mississauga, but for all of Aski," Eric said. "No pressure," Ochek said. Morgan and Eli exchanged a surprised look. Morgan wasn't sure if she'd actually heard what she thought she had. "Ochek, did you just make a joke?" she asked. "You children must be rubbing off on me." Ochek took a step into the lake. "Now remember, swim with your heads just above the water. It's getting dark enough that if he looks out, he may not see us." "And if he sees us?" Eli asked. "We're sitting Sissipak," Eric said. "That means ducks." Morgan beat Eli to the translation this time. Sitting ducks. They waded into the lake, leaving their packs on the shore, and the children in particular were pleased that the water was warm. Morgan recalled the first week she'd been placed with Katie and James. Before school started, they'd taken her out to Grand Beach, about an hour outside of Winnipeg. The beach stretched endlessly along the water, and the sand was white and soft and hot. But the water was not. Near the end of summer, the lake still felt terribly cold, and it took several minutes before her body adjusted to the temperature. She wasn't sure if it ever did. But this was like swimming in lukewarm bathtub water, the kind of warmth you get after you've been sitting in the tub for an hour. It made the swim as pleasant as it could be, given the circumstances. They swam with their noses above the water, and sometimes with their noses below the water, after big gulps of air. If the man looked out from the window, he might see something that looked more like driftwood than animals and human beings. This was especially important now, seeing as how his meat rack was empty, and the game was scarce or absent entirely in this area of the North Country. Morgan worried that he might make like Ochek and try to eat one of his own. It wasn't far from the land to the island, but the journey was long nonetheless, because they were all dog paddling, trying their best not to disturb the water or rise too far above the surface. Eventually they came to the island and emerged from the water under cover behind the canoe. There had been no movement from within the cabin, just the heat showering out of it and light. They remained behind the canoe, their backs against the hull, out of sight from the cabin, just in case the man happened to look out the window. "Eric," Ochek whispered, "go and peek inside the cabin, very quietly." "Duh," Eric whispered back. She crawled across the grass on all fours toward the house. Excuse me. They watched as she positioned herself under the window, then slowly rose up until she was just high enough to see inside. Suddenly she collapsed on all fours and scurried back over to the canoe. "The birds are in a sack, hanging from the ceiling," Eric reported. "Tataku, the traitor crane, is perched at the foot of the man's bed, right under the sack, warm and happy as a clam." "Wait, perched?" Morgan tried to think if Oho had been perched. They were kind of sitting in the council hut more than perched, but still very owl-like. Isn't Tataku a being like you two are? Why isn't he, sitting on a chair or something? How does it work with birds? Pinasisak that can talk are mostly just like Pinasisak that can't, Eric explained. "Or else they couldn't fly, I think," Ochek said. "Yes, they'd be much too big," Eric said. "I think the only difference would be that they have these," Eric made her paw into a weird claw-like shape, "feathery fingers. Honestly, they're kind of weird. but they can grab things anyway. Oho always has that cane with them, Ochek said. Right? Eric said. It's funny that they can probably fly perfectly fine, but need a cane to walk. They don't fly much, but you're right. I suspect when the wait time is over, they'll fly out of joy, Ochek said. All right, so Tataku's perched, I get it, Morgan said. You guys kind of over-explained that. Hey, you're the one who needs to know everything, Isquasis, Eric said, according to your dear brother. I mean, Eli said, she's got a point. You do need to know everything. Morgan said, why are you ganging up on the curious girl? And the man, Ochek said, trying to steer the conversation back on track. What is he doing? Eric cleared her throat and said, sleeping. Good. Ochek scanned the group, one by one, with fierce determination. A sack, you say? Yes, like the empty one that you had when you tried to kill me, Eric explained. Thanks for reminding me, Ochek rolled his eyes. The summer birds being in a sack makes things easier, actually. What do we do? Morgan watched as Ochek's black eyes darted back and forth. Okay, he whispered. I have a plan. The other three leaned in, and Ochek went over each of their roles in retrieving the summer birds from the cabin. They broke off and took their positions. Eli, with great caution, pushed the canoe into the water, placed the paddles inside the vessel, and held it in place, ready for their escape. Eric crept along the shoreline until she was right out in the open, and she waited there. Ochek and Morgan ducked low, crossed over the grass, and stopped underneath the window. Ochek handed Morgan a thin strip of fabric he'd torn from his clothing and made into a slip knot. Ready, Isquasis? She gripped the fabric in her fist. Ready. Ochek nodded at Eli, then at Eric. Seeing the signal, Eli got into the canoe and angled it to face northeast, away from the dying sun, towards Mississauga. Once Eli was set and keeping the canoe aimed properly with one of its paddles, Eric got to her feet, cupped her mouth, and started making psst noises towards the house, doing her best to get Tataku's attention while trying not to wake the man. It worked. There was rustling inside the dwelling. It was Tataku flapping his wings, moving from his spot at the foot of the bed to the window. What's going on out there? As soon as he appeared in the window, poking his head out into the open, Ochek reached up and grabbed his beak, holding it shut so that Tataku couldn't alert the man. Quickly, Ochek whispered. Morgan put the knot over Tataku's beak and pulled, forcing it to stay shut. Ochek yanked the crane out of the window. Once in the air, Tataku kept flying away from the island and out across the water, pulling at the string with his feather fingers on the way in an attempt to get the slip knot off. With Tataku gone, Morgan locked her fingers together to boost Ochek up. Once he was on the windowsill, he signaled to Eric, who ran to the canoe and jumped inside. Both she and Eli were ready for a clean getaway. Morgan turned back to the window to watch Ochek, who had lowered himself carefully inside and tiptoed across the floor. The man was sleeping in a chair, turned away from Ochek and her, his bald head slumped to one side, snoring loudly with every inhalation. The bag, which looked very much like a burlap sack, hung from the ceiling like a chandelier, with a million tiny shafts of light shooting from it. To reach the bag, Ochek needed to stand on the foot of the man's bed. He slid his knife out from his belt and began to saw at the twine in agonizing, slow lashes. To keep his balance, because each sawing motion threw him off, he shifted his feet. And every time he shifted his feet, the bed creaked. Over the man's snoring, the creaks weren't all that loud, but Morgan found herself gripping the windowsill so tightly that her knuckles were white. When the job was almost done, Ochek's foot slipped, and he stumbled, and the creaks that followed one after the other were like thunder. The man's head jerked to attention. Ochek flipped the knife around in his paw, ready for an attack, and stood as still as a statue. Morgan didn't breathe. She lowered her body so that she could only just barely see over the sill. The man looked as though he was about to turn his head. He would have seen Ochek, and the bag of summer birds hanging perilously from the ceiling. But he just repositioned his head against the back of the chair, still facing away, and the snoring continued. Ochek looked at Morgan, relieved, and continued his work until there was one last thread holding the bag in place, no thicker than a piece of dental floss. The animal being put his paws underneath the bag, made one last stroke, and it fell silently into his possession. As soon as Morgan was sure he had the bag of summer birds, she ran to the canoe, and all three of them waited for Ochek. He emerged from the window with the sack over his shoulder and rushed towards them. The sun had fallen by then, and Ochek, with the shining bag in his arms, looked like a miniature sun sprinting out of the darkness, as though eager for the night to end. The canoe took off from the shore. Eli in the bow seat and Eric in the stern powered their paddles through the water, urging the vessel away from the island and ever closer to land. "We did it!" Eric cried, and Tataki was probably still trying to get the knot off his beak. "We've almost done it," Ochek said, tempering their excitement. He was sitting in the center of the canoe with Morgan, the bag wrapped securely in his arms. "We've a journey still ahead." "Can't you just let them out of the bag now?" Morgan asked, staring at the bag. The birds were flying around inside like they'd chugged coffee, bumping against the fabric like little heartbeats. She heard muffled, excited chirping. "Not yet," Ochek said. "We need to ensure the green time begins in Mississauga for the sake of the others." "The closer the better," Eric said. "Paddle faster and stop talking if you want to be closer," said Eli, who was doing most of the work. Morgan looked back at the squirrel, who picked up the pace after Eli's command. Their moment of success, a moment that couldn't have seemed more distant than when they'd left Mississauga, then demanded silence. Calm. There was a gentle and cool breeze, the moon and its white light glowing overhead. Morgan spread her fingers out, touched her fingertips to the water, and watched the trails left behind. The four lines continued to spread farther apart behind the boat, like tiny wakes. Thwap! Ochek hunched over and the bag fell from his arms. "Ochek!" Morgan lunged towards him, lifted his head. He was grimacing in pain, clutching at his shoulder. Morgan moved the paw to find an arrowhead sticking out from beneath his fur. She looked behind him, on the other side of his shoulder, to find the end of an arrow protruding from his body, its beautiful, terrible feathers illuminated by the bag of summer birds. Whoosh! Another arrow zipped past Morgan's head. She looked toward the island to see the man on the shore, aiming his bow toward the canoe.